All right, red light is blinking, ladies. So we are live, not really live, but we're recording our very first episode. So if you guys did not listen to our intro, you totally should, because it will give a little bit of background on why we decided to do this case first. At least I hope it will kind of allude to why we decided to do this case first. But without further ado, the case we're going to cover today is the Green River Killer, which you don't know where the Green River is. That's okay, because there's probably a lot of Green Rivers in the United States. But the Green River we're talking about is in Washington State, and we were born and raised, at least partially raised, in Washington State. We grew up in California for a while too, but Washington is home for us. So we decided to do this as our first case because we didn't know anyone that was involved, but it is kind of quote unquote close to home. Um, so the way we're going to do this, if you can't tell by the name of the podcast, which is Who, What, Where, I am going to walk through the facts of the case. So who, what, where, when, why, and how. And then Abigail and Caitlin are going to kind of tell me what their thoughts are. I know Abby has a lot of knowledge about this case, but I don't think Caitlin does. So they will kind of not know exactly what's happening. And so they'll only know really what I'm telling them. So we'll start off by learning a little bit about Gary Ridgway himself. So Gary Ridgway was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, to his mother, Mary and Thomas Ridgway. However, Gary was raised near the SeaTac airport, which would later become SeaTac, Washington. It's actually a city. And his home life was, as we would probably imagine with most serial killers, not the best. His parents fought pretty violently a few different times in his life. I did also see on a few things that it seemed to say maybe he was also involved in the violent fights sometimes. So there was some violence onto him as well, possibly. And then when Ridgway was young, this was actually kind of an interesting note that I found. He would wet his bed pretty frequently, and his mother would wash his genitals every time after it happened. So once he actually got caught and was like in the process of being sentenced, and they were doing all his like psych evaluations and everything, he told the defense psychologist that he had conflicting feelings of anger and sexual attraction towards his mother and fantasized often about killing her. So that to me is kind of like red flag where all of that kind of came from. And then we'll talk a little about this later too, but he did kill only women. So obviously there's a connection there. And Ridgway attended Tyee High School in SeaTac, Washington. In high school, Ridgway was held back a year. He was said to have an IQ of like the low 80s. So he wasn't a very intelligent individual. Again, something that sometimes you see in serial killer cases. And he had one violent incident in high school, at least one that was reported, where he did stab a 6-year-old boy, and took him like out into the middle of the woods before he actually stabbed him. It said that he stabbed him in his liver, which is like very specific. I don't think that really matters, but I don't know. I guess
What if
maybe
he
he,
just happened to hit his liver?
yeah. I mean, I don't know if I would like see someone and be like, oh, that's where their liver is. Let me stab them there. But, obviously, Ridgway and I aren't super similar. Um, the boy did survive the attack, so he didn't die, and I don't think there were any charges pressed against him either. Ridgway was he was a poor student, but he was also poor. They didn't have a ton of money. And so he went to fight in the Vietnam War after high school. And so there's probably something connected to what he had to go through in Vietnam too, with what he ended up doing to all these women. He eventually was honorably discharged from the service. When he was overseas, he had frequent encounters with sex workers and contracted gonorrhea. And then in the article I read about that, he didn't care that he had gonorrhea. Like he knew he did, and he just kept having unprotected sex with these sex workers. This will come back into the picture in a little bit too. Once he returned, though, to the United States, to Washington State, he got a steady job painting trucks, which he kept the same job for 30 years. He also married multiple times, including his high school sweetheart, who he married before he left for the war. But interestingly enough, he was a frequent customer of prostitutes. But he did
Very
consider
frequent,
himself,
you could say.
yeah, he considered himself a very religious man. So I think I read that sometime during his second marriage, that was when he started being very religious. So really, he was having a lot of conflicting issues with, you know, using and abusing prostitutes, but also being married and considering himself to be religious. Um, Ridgway was married, like I said, 3 times, and he did have several ex-girlfriends, all of whom he tried to have sex with in public areas and or the woods, which again will connect to the killings themselves once we get into that. Eventually, we will find that some of the places that they found dead bodies were actually places that he had alluded to his wives or girlfriends that he would like to have sex with them at. His first wife cheated on him. His second wife, who he does have a son with, stated that he liked to practice walking noiselessly, which is kind of creepy.
Yeah,
like that.
he would walk around the house and like sneak up on her and scare her because he wanted to see if he could be like quiet, which is interesting because he didn't really use that tactic to get any of his victims.
No,
He
we'll
was
talk
just
about
kind
that.
of weird.
Yeah, that is just kind of
A lot weird.
a creepy thing. And just like a side note, once he did get arrested, which it took them a while to figure out that it was him, his like neighbors and everyone was like, yeah, he was just like a normal guy. He wasn't that weird. Obviously this wife knew that he liked to practice walking noiselessly, which is a little weird, I would say. Red flag number 2, or like 3 or 4 at this point. But yeah, so a potential wife did leave him for another man. Okay, so that's another low blow. And his third wife was married to him until 2002. So his third wife, I believe, is the one that he married in around that time the killings slowed down like
Yes.
tremendously. So clearly there was something going on in their marriage that made it so it wasn't as easy for him to kill. It's really interesting because he did have wives and a family and a normal job that he kept for 30 years. It was kind of the perfect alibi because he clearly wasn't showing enough of himself for any of these people to think that he was suspicious. So that is an interesting point to make. Yes, and I'll end the Who section with, as we can kind of already tell, he had a love-hate relationship with sex workers. So he often complained that there were like so many in his area and he hated that. But he often, like very frequently, was using their services. I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but his dad did a few times have relations with prostitutes too, with sex workers. So that is an interesting thing to add, and he would talk about that like kind of in a violent manner or a bad way with Gary. So Gary, it feels weird calling him Gary, but his name was Gary Ridgway. Okay.
I also have one more thing about the potential wife. They were engaged and they actually met in a like support group called Parents Without Partners. And then she met somebody else and left him. And so I just thought that might be relevant because
They were
he seems to have a
engaged?
lot. Yeah, they were engaged.
Oh, wow.
And she got married very shortly after to another man.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so his second wife is the one that he has a son with. So he would have recently had a son, and we'll later find out that he would show photos of his son to prostitutes to get them to kind of trust him and see him as a more normal person.
Yes.
So that's kind of creepy too.
Yeah, so the other fiance was they were planning to get married in summer of 1984. And so at that point, his son was almost 10 because his son was born in 75.
Okay, that's good to know too. All right, so moving on to the second W, which is what. So this is kind of just going to be like, what did he do? Like, what did he actually do? What do we have him on? Why is he in jail now? So Ridgway killed at least 49 women along Pacific Highway South near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. However, similar to another serial killer in Washington and the Pacific Northwest, Ted Bundy, the number of women he actually killed varies depending on who or where you find that information. It was also kind of thought that maybe he was only saying that he killed more to kind of get more attention. I think that's part of the reason why some serial killers do what they do. So, similar to Ted Bundy, like I just said, he admitted to killing 71 people, but eventually he might have thrown around the number of 90 women during his spree, but he was only convicted of 49 deaths, almost all of which they have found the remains and they have identified the bodies. But I want to say there is 1 to 3 of them that they have not found the bodies of, and so they don't know technically who those people are or were. During the period he was, I mentioned this a little bit before, but during that period that he was married to Judith Mawson, which was his third wife, his killings went down drastically. Only 3 of his victims were killed following his marriage to her. So that is something to know. Just kind of interesting. I don't know really how much
I wonder
that has
what
to do.
changed there. Well, yeah, like what changed?
Well, so like
That's
I was
interesting to
saying,
me.
the weird part to me is that, a lot of the articles I was reading were saying, well, like the fact that he was like a normal person and he had a wife and children or a kid, and he had a normal job was like the perfect alibi. So I wonder if Judith was just like more in his business. And so
Oh.
he just simply didn't have as much time. Because we'll get into the actual like murders and we'll talk about all the information there. And you have to wonder how much time out of his week was going into
A
literally
lot.
killing people. So
It seems like a lot.
so that's why I'm
think-
saying I wonder if Judith was just more attentive to him, sort of, and so he was spending more time with her, and so he didn't have as much time to go out and do these things, because clearly he is a serial killer. So I don't think it was like he finally found love with his third wife and they were in so much love that he didn't want to kill again. No, I don't think that's at all the case. I think that there was probably just more, I don't know, they just were together more, or she was more nosy or something, because clearly he wasn't letting them know. He wasn't giving them any reason to be suspicious. That's why it took so long for people to find out who it was.
So there's a documentary about Gary Ridgway. I can't remember what it's called, but it's on Amazon Prime. And I'm pretty sure they show, it's either like an interview video or it's like audio. But he said something like, he's like talking about how it's like a lot of work to kill people.
Yeah, so
I
he
think
talks
that's
about
him.
that
I'm
very
pretty sure I'm thinking of
a
the right
lot
person.
of times. I actually have a couple of screenshots about it, but he definitely said like repeatedly in his interviews that he would have killed more women if it wasn't so much work and if it wasn't so much so expensive. He thought it was expensive because the ones that he didn't kill, he was paying, and then as well as the gas he said was expensive. Like that was his concern, was the gas to drive around up and down the PHS. And yeah, it was super creepy, super weird.
We'll
Yeah.
talk about, there's another bit that kind of goes with that, that I'll talk about a little bit more later, about how he just like, he was thinking so much about what was the easiest and best way for him to get away with everything. So
He also, another little thing about him saying that is he said that he wished that there was just like a mine that he could drop the bodies into so that it wasn't as much work to dispose of them. Like I'll find the direct quote, but it was so so weird and uncomfy to read. I was like, oh, that's wrong.
What a weirdo. I mean, like, dude, obviously there wouldn't be that because then, like, we wouldn't be able to
Right.
find out. Like, what a. I mean, it goes with that kind of like serial killer mentality that someone like Ted Bundy had, like that they were untouchable, like they were the best, and they were going to be, you know, like undiscovered forever, and they were going to be able to keep doing it.
Oh, another thing that he said was, why, if it isn't mine, because I have pride in what I do, I don't want to take it from anybody else. So he said he has pride in his murders. Yeah, icky.
Ew.
So the
It's
weirdest
interesting that he had such a low IQ.
Yeah.
Like his low 80s is low.
Yeah, but the weirdest part to me about him having pride in his murders is that the way he murdered the women wasn't like anything crazy
or special at all.
No, and so I assume when he says that he had pride, he probably is talking about when he disposed of the bodies. Because he did
because nobody found them.
Yeah,
like
or they would find them, but they didn't know who was doing this.
They didn't connect any.
Yeah, they found them like over a long period of time, but they had a really hard time connecting them to a person. And we'll get into it more, but they interviewed him many times, and he was just like, he even passed polygraphs and everything.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called, a polygraph?
Yeah.
A lie detector?
Yeah.
Oh, it sounded wrong, and I was like,
it's called a polygraph.
All right, on to the third W. This kind of looks like a W. All right, so this is gonna be the where question, the question of where. We kind of discussed this already, but obviously there's significance to the name Green River, and that is a river that runs sort of from like outside Seattle through Kent and Auburn. It's actually a pretty lengthy river, so I don't know. You could probably find a map of it. It's pretty lengthy, so he had plenty of room to dump some bodies. The reason why that became like the nickname and the name of the case and the investigators like group was because the first few bodies turned up in or along. I couldn't figure out if all of them turned up inside of the river, but a lot of them were just kind of on the bank of the river. And then later he would also dump some of his victims near the SeaTac International Airport, which was close to where he lived. And I did see that there was like 2 bodies, I think, that ended up down in Portland. So I don't know why. I'm not sure, Abby, if you know why he ended up going down to Portland to dump those 2 bodies.
I remember reading that he took those 2 down to Portland into Tigard, I believe, Tigard, Oregon.
Okay.
And the reason he took them down there was because he wanted to make the task force that was assigned to the Green River Killer case think that for some reason the killer moved down to Portland and was killing there. So he actually took his son, who I can't remember the name of, and
Matthew, I think
that sounds right. But
he might have changed his name. Hopefully he changed it.
Hopefully.
I don't know why you would want to keep
right.
Yeah.
But he actually
did.
took so he killed them here, and I literally thought that I had them written down, but he killed them here and drove them down to Tigard, Oregon, which is like right outside Portland, with his son in the truck.
So like they were in the trunk and his son
they were in like the truck.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, he did almost all of his killings. He used his truck.
Yeah. Their names, the 2 women that were found in Tigard, were Denise Bush and Shirley Sherrill, and then 1 unidentified body.
Yeah.
How many? Because they found a bunch of bodies that like he admitted to, right? But they didn't know who they were.
Yeah, there was a few.
Like they didn't connect like the missing people
but,
to
I mean,
murders at the end, I don't think.
I also saw that they were like still finding like literally skeleton, like bones, like skulls,
Yeah.
up until like 2011 or 2013. So it's still, even though it happened so long ago that his like killing spree occurred, which was like 1982 to 1988, it's still kind of like a current case because he literally killed that many people.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
kind of
so there's 3 unidentified white females and 1 unidentified black female.
okay.
And then the rest they all have names for. So, and I thought
Yeah.
maybe we'll probably read off a list of all of the names because I feel like that's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
So 4 total.
4
Unidentified.
unidentified.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So not actually, honestly, they've identified a good portion of the ones
lot.
that they've actually found the remains of.
Well, that was part of his plea deal, right? Was telling them where he remembered.
Yeah, which we will get into that. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I
Not
have
to
a
jump the
point
gun.
about that. And just the last little bit on where where the murders did take place. He didn't usually kill people in wooded areas, which is where he would dispose of the bodies. He usually actually killed people inside of his truck or his home, and then he would take them to the wooded areas. So again, just weird that he would kill. I mean, clearly this is very much aggravated. He was contemplating and thinking about what the best, easiest way would to be, to kill him and then drive him out and dump him. Okay. 4th W is when. So I have like a few key dates. The first one that I have is 1980. So in 1980, he was arrested for choking a prostitute, but no charges were filed against him, probably because the prostitute was afraid to testify, press charges. So that's an interesting point. In 1982, he was arrested for solicitation. And then shortly after that is when they believed that the killings began. So he clearly had this, like I said before, this love-hate relationship with sex workers and prostitutes. Like, most of his killings were of sex workers and prostitutes. There were a few that were just kind of
opportunistic.
Yeah, and they were usually younger women who were like runaways. One, actually, his first murder, the one that we think at least was his first murder. She was a younger girl. She was like 16, and she had just run away from her foster home.
That's Wendy Caulfield.
Yeah, so people that were in his mind easy to kill, and also he does talk about later that the reason why he killed those people is because he basically thought that they were never going to be missed and people weren't going to try to get them to be found. So that's
and he was like weak, like he was afraid, like
he was also
it wasn't like he was in any way like confident about taking these girls. It was like he literally was like a little bitch, and so he wanted to get people that were easy to catch, I think.
Well, and like I said, about the picture part, about him showing a picture of like his son to lure them in, that was totally because he knew that he was creepy as hell. And so if he used that photo, he could get them in and then be able to take them and kill them and then throw them out. So
yeah, he's a weird looking dude.
And then again, 1982, the last known murder occurred in 1998. So that was his killing spree, we think, was 1982 to 1998. Again, who knows what anything this guy is saying is real. All we know is real is what we have evidence for. So the evidence leads to that being the kind of killing spree.
In his interviews, he talks a lot about, I have the exact quote somewhere, but he said it was very possible that he was killing in the 1970s. And he has a lot of interviews where he just gives like weird, elusive answers like that. Like he's not like, yeah, I killed in the 70s, but he does talk about it a couple times that he very possibly was killing in the 70s.
See, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know. Who knows?
He also mentions a lot that he has he kept killing until his arrest. He just slowed down, and he uses that word in like multiple different interviews, that I kept killing but I just slowed down. And it's
like that's
really
better. Like that like that's
good
okay.
for you.
Oh yeah, good job, Gary.
But the bulk of the women were 1982 to 1984. Yeah, he slowed his killings starting in 1984, it looks like. Yeah, which is just so sad. So
I
sad.
mean, it's crazy to me that the majority of his killings, which could have been upwards of 90 people, occurred in 2 years. So like we were
Yeah.
saying before, this guy was spending like working a full-time job murdering people and disposing
And a
of their
full-time
bodies.
job.
And a full-time job, right? And so that's why it's just insane to me. As previously mentioned, around the age of 15, 16, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy just to see what it felt like to kill. So,
Yeah.
and the part that's interesting to me about that is he very much had an MO, like he killed all women. Almost all were sex workers or prostitutes. So I thought it was weird that his first kind of outlet of trying to kill somebody, sort of, I don't know if he was actually trying to kill this little boy, or if he was just crazy. I don't know.
Wait,
I mean,
did you say he
both.
was 15?
He was like 15, 16.
Gary was around that age, and the boy was only 6 years old. So
and he found him.
He like found him and lured him into the woods and then stabbed him. But the kid survived. So, and obviously this man, Gary, has no problem killing people. So I just think it's interesting that he chose to not kill this little boy, but he killed all these women. Like,
I think that was just like how it got started, and he like realized. But he also talks about the reason that he didn't kill men was that it gave him no sexual satisfaction.
Which we'll get into that too, about his kind of creepy sexual tendencies.
So creepy. Another thing though that I want to mention is I mentioned that there was a Black unidentified victim, but here's a quote from him about such victims. He mainly killed white women, but also a few Asian women and Black women. And he declared, I'd rather have white, but I'd much rather have white, but Black was fine. It's just garbage, just something to screw and kill her and dump her. And that is a direct quote.
Ew.
So he was like racist and hated women.
Yes. And
can't say I'm surprised.
He also, I think like something that will come up a lot is he had kind of, it could have been like nerves from the interviews, but he stutters a lot. So like
interesting.
He'll repeat himself multiple times. It's interesting. There's a lot of ellipses in his little quotes, but yeah, I just thought that was definitely worth mentioning because it shows you what kind of person he is.
Isn't ellipses the like 3 periods?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Caitlin.
Just checking.
Just checking. Gotta double check, you know?
Hey, maybe some people listening don't know what that means either. So you're welcome.
Okay.
I'm here for you.
Fifth W. I think we're on to the 5th W, which is why. So this is going to be kind of all these things that technically didn't come out until after he was founded, because obviously we wouldn't know why he was killing these people while he was killing them, except for the fact that he's a complete crazy person. Okay, so he claimed later, after admitting to the murders, that his main goal was to kill as many prostitutes as possible. So we've already talked about the fact that this man hates prostitutes and sex workers, although he loves to have sex with them. So just a crappy person overall. He also thought that because of their jobs, they wouldn't be reported missing. So I mentioned that. That's also why he killed people that were, just
or like runaways.
They didn't go to work. They didn't have like a quote unquote like office job or normal job where they went in every day and people would be like, oh, that person is missing. They haven't been here in a couple days. Which kind of brings me to a point that is interesting to make too, that a lot of the people that he murdered, by the time they found them, they were skeletons. So that's interesting to me too.
So I wonder if that like kind of like means he was killing earlier than he originally said.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Where he was like, oh, I might have killed in the 70s. Like maybe he was.
He probably was. Yeah.
Because it's harder. I think it's a lot harder like to like date skeletons than it is bodies.
I think so. Remain.
Like when there's still like, it's gonna sound so gross, but when there's still like decomposition going on, but once it's just bones, I think it's harder for them to be like,
and that's
how old it is.
I think this case is kind of weirdly similar to Ted Bundy, because it was around the same time, I'm pretty sure. And he
I
killed,
think Gary Ridgway was a little bit later. I
okay,
think.
and he killed a lot
Yeah.
of, they both killed a lot of
Mhm.
people.
Yeah.
And as we know in the Ted Bundy case, like DNA and FBI, like all that stuff was so, like, compared to what we have today, it was so, like, just not
Primitive.
as good.
Yeah.
You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so I think that, like, if this case happened like more recently, like in like the 2000s, he would have been caught like almost immediately, because he would have been able to figure out, probably being able to date the skeletons a lot
Yeah.
easier, you know, the skeletal remains. So I don't know if the technical term is skeletons, but it was Halloween yesterday, so I'm saying skeletons instead of skeletal remains, which I
I
think is
think it's
technically
like it's still classified as
more.
remains, but like there's so many. I was just listening to a podcast about body farms, and they just
Ew.
basically study the decomposition of bodies like in the natural sense to help with
Oh,
investigations.
I mean,
Okay,
honestly,
interesting.
not bad. I would be okay with
Don't
that, I think.
volunteer me for that. No, I'm
Okay,
good.
we'll
I'm
keep that
good.
in mind.
I mean, yeah, it's just interesting that like it takes so long for, because there's just so many processes that decompose a body. First of all, he put some of them in the river, so that's going to completely change like how we're able to date how old the body is. So like it's amazing that we're even able to do it at all if they're in a river.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So he claims that he never intended to kill, which I think is a lie. But he rage killed when prostitutes were not giving him what he wanted or hurrying him along, which turned into enjoying the kill and the start of killing for sexual release. Also, like we discussed a little bit earlier, he did have a love-hate relationship with prostitutes, so he killed them, obviously, but then he also had sex with them, so he was
A
clearly
total hypocrite.
all sorts of
Like
messed up
textbook definition of a hypocrite.
And then he claimed that he never intended to kill, but he rage killed when prostitutes were not giving him what he wanted or asking him to hurry, which turned into enjoying the kill and the starting of killing for sexual release. So I think that that's a lie, that he never intended to kill, because
Yeah,
clearly
totally.
he was torn up about like whether or not he wanted to like just have sex with these people. I mean, I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think that's a lie? Do you think that he actually always intended to kill them?
I think that he's so confusing because he'll say in his different interviews like totally different things. Like he literally has said he always intended to kill the women, and then he has also said I never
That he never
intended to
yeah,
kill.
weird.
So it's so strange, and I really am not sure, but yeah, I think that he is a malicious person and that there was always some bad intent there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's
Well, I
hard
think
because he was
it's
honest about a lot of stuff, but I don't trust a thing he says, really.
yeah.
The
Well,
only
and I
time he
think
was
it's
honest was when it was in his favor for his plea agreement that we'll talk about later. Okay, sorry,
yeah.
Hannah, go ahead.
It's interesting to me that it's almost like this is the way he rationalized that he enjoyed it. Like he basically said, okay, well, if they're pissing me off and then I kill them, then that's okay if I enjoy killing them. Almost.
Yes.
That's kind of maybe the way I am trying to interpret that, just to make a little bit more sense of it. Because honestly, like you're saying, we can't trust really most of what this person says, but I do think that there definitely was intent pretty much the entire time. Because the way he went about these things, it, especially like the showing the picture of his son and like getting them to feel comfortable, to me that doesn't mean like that you're just gonna have sex with this person and then leave them. Like it means that you're gonna try to make them feel comfortable so you can sneak up and kill them, basically.
I don't know if you guys have this information, but is he like Ted Bundy? Like he has had a couple like escaped victims and or let them go victims, like that kind of.
So he talks a lot about he was very big on disguising being a murderer, which is why it took him so long to get caught. So he calls them dates in his interviews. He would pick up prostitutes and take them on a date and then not kill them so that he could build a good reputation among the prostitutes along the PHS.
As terrible as it sounds, that like makes a lot of sense.
It does, which is why I'm like, how did he have an IQ of 80? Like, it's so weird. But also he
weird.
talks about one victim in particular that I'm thinking of is this one prostitute that he picked up, he took to the woods and to one of his locations where he had hidden a body, and she saw the body and like freaked out.
Yeah,
and
understandably
scared and was like, oh my god, we gotta go, like take me back. And he like took her back and let her go, and then went back and buried the body because
she didn't did she report this?
I wouldn't if I was like, I'm being a prostitute in the woods. Like, she probably was afraid.
Oh,
well,
shoot, I didn't even think about that.
He just like, and also maybe she didn't think, if he was in theory this super non-creepy dude, kind of normal dude that just liked the physical love of a sex worker, then I don't know if my first thought would be, oh my god, this guy is gonna kill me. You know, like, I don't know.
Like, you don't think she even suspected that
maybe
body
not.
was...
Maybe she was just like, oh my gosh, there's someone dead out here.
Yeah, and maybe he was really good about being like, you know,
also
like,
shocked.
Maybe.
Shock, because I could see that being why she didn't think that it was him, if he was really that great at hiding that he knew that it was there. But that convinces me that he had a really low IQ, because who would forget that they put a body there and didn't bury it?
Oh, like he admitted to like having just forgotten that the body was there.
Yeah.
Weird.
Well, he didn't say anything about that, but why else would he take her back to this location?
And that,
especially if he was just gonna let her go and not like torture her with the idea of
So
that's what I'm saying, is like, why was he not gonna kill her? It was almost like that ruined his normal plan of, because the way he would do it, we'll talk about this in a second, but we'll talk about the way he killed people, but like, it seems like almost every single person that he killed in pretty much the same exact way. So it was like her seeing this dead body. If he would have killed her then, that like wouldn't have been what in his idea of like how to kill people.
Yes,
so he didn't do it, which is weird.
I'm sure we'll get to it in just a minute with Hannah, but I have a couple quotes here that I think are pertinent, but the detective was interviewing him, and he says, I have a burden of having to find a place to put it. And he says, the detective says, you have a burden? And he says, a burden, yes. Like, he thought that he was somehow burdened by these women's bodies that he was murdering. And then I'm sure we'll also talk about it with Hannah, but he, at one point in his killing spree, was practicing necrophilia, and it wasn't that he was as much into necrophilia as he was too lazy. Like, this sounds horrible, but he was too lazy to go get another body, because he was like,
it was easier for him to
work, and so he would just keep their bodies. And
I have that in my notes for
I'm
later.
sure Hannah will talk about it too, but he would strangle them and then continue to have sex with them, and then have sex with them until he basically was like done with her, and dispose of that body and get a new body. And so it was a short period of time in his murder spree where he would do that, and then he got tired of having, this is horrible, he got tired of having sex with their cold bodies, basically, is what he said. And
we should definitely make the distinction that he was definitely raping them. It wasn't like he was having
totally
sex with them.
And it might have,
I think it's important to use the word
and it might have started out,
I agree.
I think technically, I mean, these women were sex workers, so the idea was that he would pick them up, he would take them on a date, and they would start having consensual sex. And then
it would
then
rape.
And I'll talk about that in the how section.
And then
too.
I don't think that I think that when it turned into rape was when they were dead, because they were consenting when they were alive,
and he started strangling them and like killed them, basically.
So they didn't have time before death to leave that situation, which is so awful. But I just want to throw one more quote out there. He said, the detective said, what it was it about having sex with a dead body that you preferred over going out and getting another woman? And he said, for one thing, you'd have to pay for it, and she was already dead. And then the detective said, so you weren't going to be paying for it if you went out and got another woman, killed her, you weren't going to be paying. And he said, that's what I spent hours looking and looking for other women to kill, a lot of gas and everything, looking for more people to kill. And then he pauses.
Ew.
The detective says, you wanted a fresh kill. And he says, something fresh instead of someone who is cold and hard to get a hard on with a cold body, which is
Ew.
so weird that
Carrie,
if he wasn't
no.
into necrophilia, why was he having sex? Like, it was literally out of pure laziness that
Yeah.
he was. Yeah, it's just so icky, so disgusting.
Well, it's like it's almost like he was into necrophilia, even if he didn't want to admit it, because
Oh yeah.
otherwise
think
the
so.
Maybe
idea,
that's
if you
it.
aren't necrophilic, like
It would
I
be
feel like it
repulsive.
wouldn't even occur to you to go.
I agree.
Yeah, exactly.
Good point. Good
There
point.
was very
So like
there was a very
liar.
clear connection between sex of any kind with these women and then killing them. Like
Yes.
he had to have both, and so he didn't care if
Uh-huh.
it was before or after they were dead. He was
And
gonna do it.
he does mention strangling women, and it gets a little graphic. I don't know how graphic you want me to get, but he does mention having sex with women and strangling them from behind while he is having sex with them, and then climaxing after she is dead, and like very shortly after. And I personally think, from rooting through all these interviews, that was it for him, was that he needed her to die for the sexual gratification.
Well, it's like he needed to be responsible for the death.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
Which is so, and I think that's why he
wouldn't
didn't kill.
he wouldn't have just taken any old body that happened to be dead. He went
Mm-mm.
back to bodies that he had already killed.
It had to be somebody he killed. Exactly. 100%.
All right, it's finishing up the why section. So he also states that he was fueled by anger from women using manipulation to move up at work, tenants paying their rent late, and his many divorces. So he clearly had a hatred of women. I mean, that's like simply put, that is what's what there. And like we mentioned at the beginning with the who section, this to me, in my opinion, all started with him hating his mother, but also possibly having weird sexual feelings for her. All right, moving on to how. So this is like the section I have the most information for, because it's the last section, and it's also like where we discuss actually what went down. So Ridgway, like we mentioned, would pick up sex workers and runaways along Pacific Highway South. They would usually have sex, and during intercourse, Ridgway would strangle them to death. So he would often, like Abby was mentioning previously, while they were having sex, he would strangle them from behind. So he would, and not strangle like with his two hands, he would put his arm like around their neck and then pull with his other arm back. I don't know if you guys can really get that visual in your mind. It's hard to imagine for sure. But once the killings were done, so he did kill at his house, and he also would kill in his truck. Those were the two that I found. And then I don't know if I ever saw that he had sex and killed them outside. He would typically kill them in either his car or his house, and then he would dump them outside. Oh, go ahead, Abby.
I did see that I don't remember seeing anything about him killing outside in the woods along the Green River, but he would dump bodies there and return to have sex with them there.
Right.
So that is weird in itself.
Yeah. He would often dump the bodies in clusters, and sometimes he would pose them, and most of the time they were nude. So clearly they were nude because they were probably having sex before he killed them. Actually, I would assume that all of the time they were having sex before he killed them.
I think that is assumed.
Yeah.
And they did talk about a couple victims when he was in that necrophilia period in his killings. There was a couple victims that he would literally go into the woods and have sex with them there, and then leave them exactly like that with like their legs spread open, because he didn't even like care enough to change their position, or like, and that's what's weird to me, is a lot of the times in like serial killer cases or just murder cases in general, there will be murderers that will pose their victims in like an honorable way or a respectful way or reclothe them, but he really just hated them. Didn't care. He just hated these women.
He hated them.
It's horrible, and he went through so many ways of protecting himself from getting caught that if he got scratched by a woman while killing her, he would trim their nails before like getting rid of the body, because he was he was so careful. But I don't understand how he's so not intelligent, but for some reason this was the one thing that he was good at, and it's horrible that is the one thing he was good at.
Yeah. So as we mentioned previously, he would go back a lot of the times and have sex with the dead bodies because it was a lot easier for him. He was a serial killer, but he was a lazy one at that.
Yes.
So he talks about, again, we briefly mentioned this already, that he would have killed a lot more people if it wasn't as much work. Another interesting thing that I found was that the dump sites were, I say dump sites, that sounds so like just gross, but the places he would like leave his victims were usually littered with gum and cigarettes from other people, which, first of all, gross. He was like finding those and putting them out there. But again, it goes back to him being smart about it, which is weird because it didn't seem like he was an intelligent person. So he was clearly hoping to throw off the detectives when they were looking for these women.
One other really quick thing, he once had sex with a body 30 feet away from his son sleeping in his truck.
Yeah, ew.
Which is just horrible and
you
disgusting.
Suck, Gary. If you're listening to this, Gary, we hate you.
You suck, Gary. We hate you. But I also like feel so bad for his son. Like,
oh yeah,
I'm sure his son knows about all of this now, and like, I would just be so traumatized thinking like, oh.
So how old would his son be now? Like 40?
He's born 75, so 45.
Oh, okay.
And so then I have a section also in the how grouping that is how did they catch him. So like we mentioned before, who knows exactly how long he was killing before 1982, because he could have been killing up during the 1970s. But by August of 1982, King County Police believed it was a serial killer. Obviously, King County Police, finally, they got caught onto that.
Only took them long enough.
Right. So they were they were technically a part of this group called the Green River Task Force, and they were confused. They were stumped completely on who it was, which again is probably because Gary did a creepily good job of not really alluding to what he was doing or who he was, by again littering the sites with gum and cigarettes from other people. And then aside from that, DNA testing was not nearly as developed as it is now. So even if they could have found like anything on the gum and cigarettes, it probably wouldn't have connected to Gary himself because he wasn't the one actually using them. And so in 1982, there was a report of Ridgway with a prostitute in a parked car, where there was later a body found, but the body wasn't found for a while, like a couple, like maybe 2 years later. And then the police report wasn't really investigated further until 1983, 1984, when the body was found. That was kind of a weird tidbit that I found. I don't know exactly how I feel about that. But it's interesting because it seems to me that he occasionally would be with prostitutes, but not kill them right away or kill them during that meeting. And like Abby was mentioning, that was kind of build up a positive reputation with the prostitutes in the area.
Horrible.
Yeah, 1983.
Why is he like weirdly smart? That's like the scary thing.
I know. Well, he's smart about like murdering
but
people.
Honestly, I guess that's like a lot of serial killers, like they don't get to kill that many times because they're stupid and make mistakes, honestly.
So he
Like-
wanted to be able to kill a lot.
So Wendy Caulfield is who we have proof that was his first victim, and that was in 1982. So he obviously has admitted or implied that he was killing in the 1970s. And so I have written down that before Wendy, he thought that he had killed women. And this was so confusing. The way it was written in the prosecutor's notes, I was like, this makes no sense. But left them in obvious places. So he would leave them in like the middle of the road. And
Wait, in the 70s?
yes.
Oh.
And he assumed that when the media didn't report on them being dead and found, that
That
he
they
didn't
survived.
kill them all the way and that they got up and left. And it like why would you be murdering
Why?
people and be like, you know what? I'm gonna test it out. Like it was like he was testing the waters, which is
Interesting.
so weird.
Weird.
Yeah, mm-mm.
You.
He was right?
So 1983, Ridgway was questioned in the disappearance of a prostitute who a witness saw her enter his truck, but then he passed a polygraph in 1984.
Mhm.
So to me, this doesn't necessarily mean that he was actually not lying on the polygraph. I would just assume that maybe the polygraph technology was not as good at it as it is now.
Well, and polygraphs aren't even admissible in court, and that's for a reason.
Yeah,
So-
because
Yeah.
they can vary. So I mean, I would probably side with the fact that he probably did kill this prostitute who was missing. Okay. So Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, I think is how you say that. They eventually would end up they were a part of the Green River Task Force. They would end up interviewing psychologists and criminologists periodically to figure out who the killer was. Or try to figure out, I suppose. So in 1984, Ted Bundy was dragged into this case. He was awaiting execution for his, I just said variety of charges because we'll have to get into Ted Bundy another day. So when Keppel and Reichert interviewed Bundy, he theorized that Ridgway would return to the bodies to have sex with him, which we found out later, as we know now, was true. Ridgway confessed to doing that. And if the police would just find a fresh grave, they would catch him in the act. For some reason, and then I put in like parentheses, maybe because Bundy was insane himself, they didn't do this. They didn't trust him. They didn't follow through with that. But it's kind of annoying because if they would have, they probably would have caught him a lot earlier. So frustrating in and of itself, but
Totally
interesting too. 1987, they obtained a search warrant for Ridgway's home and work. But they couldn't find any matching items, including carpet fibers or ropes that could be linked to the victim. So again, makes me think that this guy was way smarter than we thought. And he was doing a really good job of being clean about it.
Deceitful.
Yeah, they did get a DNA sample from Ridgway, but DNA technology was not advanced enough to match the semen recovered from the bodies. So eventually the DNA will come back to haunt him. But we'll get to that in like literally the next sentence.
Yeah.
There wasn't a huge break in the case until 2001, the year that Abigail joined us on this earth.
March 2001 was when it came out, so I actually wasn't born yet.
Technically not. She wasn't born until June. But
that's okay.
that was when Dave Reichert, who was at the time the King County Sheriff, re-examined evidence with newly developed DNA testing technology. Thank God he did that, even though it had been so long.
Well, because it was cold at this point, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
right.
Technically, yeah.
Or at least it wasn't at the forefront.
And the additional bodies that they were finding at that period of time in the Green River, they couldn't link to Gary Ridgway, and they still haven't been able to link to him. So
yeah. But you know how it is. Like there is a weird obsession and also like trend sort of for copycat killers occasionally. And so
Exactly.
it's possible that he did kill him, but it's also possible to me that there was a copycat killer doing the same thing, because it seems to me that this case was very well known in the area.
probably.
There was a match between evidence from the victims in Ridgway, and he was charged with only 4 counts of aggravated murder in December 2001. We mentioned this briefly too, but in exchange for pleading guilty and showing them the graves of all the undiscovered bodies, he was spared the death penalty. So, I mean, we won't get into the death penalty today. There was the match in 2001, and then he was arrested. That was in March 2001, and then he was arrested in December for aggravated murder. Charged, sorry, not arrested, charged. And so then the trial is lengthy. I'll just say that. Abby will talk a little bit more about it. But somehow, some way, he negotiated that he would plead guilty and show them all the undiscovered bodies so that he would not have to have the death penalty. So in order to actually avoid execution, though, Ridgway had to provide a complete, truthful, and candid account of all victims and answer all questions asked of him, including giving the locations of every one of them. If he failed to identify a murder that was later connected to him, he would then be retried, including the death penalty. So yeah, that's understandable to me. Good. I'm glad they did that. He was sentenced to life in prison in December 2003. So again, there's a little bit of a gap there. Abby will discuss. The specifics of his sentencing were 48 life sentences with 10 years added to each sentence for evidence tampering. Grand total coming to 48 life sentences plus 480 years. He is currently serving his sentence until his death at the Washington State Penitentiary. So yeah, he'll be in jail forever. He's still alive.
Honestly, I hope he lives like till he's really old and he's like shitting himself. That's what sometimes hate how they get like they'll get cancer and die like 10 years into prison.
You didn't
like that's not fair.
Escape.
No, that's
like
no.
You didn't. No, you don't get a nice death. Screw you.
Yeah. So this case is solved. He is in jail, but Abby will fill in some of the blanks too.
Yeah. So as Hannah said, March 2001. The King County Sheriff, what was his name? I don't remember.
Dave Reichert.
He went and resubmitted DNA evidence to a private company, which is called like Micro something. I don't remember. But a private DNA testing company as well as the government one.
Why?
Just so they can get 2 different perspectives. It happens a lot in case like trials that they'll want a private and a government one because then it's like less biased, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because I mean, you never know what could happen to the DNA. Like, I mean, I feel like I see on TV shows all the time if there's DNA testing, like plenty of things can happen to the DNA.
Yeah, and it's kind of like high school science project when they make you do like multiple trials to make sure. I mean, that's at least how I think of it, is that you want corroboration and you want to be able to be like these 2 match, which means there's overwhelming evidence that
I mean, and they wanted to get this guy on dozens of murders.
Yeah.
So
as much as they could.
Yeah.
So September 2001, they analyzed swabs from Marcia Chapman, which is one of his early victims.
Probably Marcia, right?
It could be Marcia or Marcia. I don't know. Sorry, Marcia.
Or Marcia.
But they matched, and that was a vaginal swab of partial DNA from him. And then Opal Mills, they found pubic hairs of his on her that matched his DNA. Carol Christensen, the DNA they found inside of her matched as well. And then November 16th of 2001, he attempted to pick up an undercover King County sheriff's officer on the Pacific Highway South. And while being booked, requested that they don't contact his wife for picking up a prostitute, which
no crap.
I wouldn't want to contact my wife either.
Wait, so interesting. So quick little tidbit. They wouldn't have been able to swab for his DNA if all of his victims would have been in skeletal remains. So I guess
there must have been.
good that there were a few that were still, I mean, it's not good, obviously, but probably for the better of the world that Gary Ridgway is locked up now, that there were a few that weren't fully decomposed so they could actually get that DNA.
Yeah,
Anyway,
totally.
go ahead.
Oh,
Continue.
you're good. And then he also stated when they were interviewing him from getting booked from that arrest of soliciting a prostitute, which was an undercover cop, he stated, and this is a direct quote, "You can contact the Green River Task Force. They know me real well."
What a savage.
Because they had contacted him so many times and done all those interviews and polygraphs, and he literally was like, they know me and they can't catch me.
Just like Ted Bundy, super
Yes.
cocky.
100%.
Were there a lot of other suspects?
No.
Oh,
Pretty much none from what
but
I
they just couldn't, it was just Gary, but they couldn't get him on it.
They didn't have any evidence, and yeah, that's why in the early 2000s when all of that DNA was retested and they could finally connect it. But anyways, November 30th of 2001, they arrested him leaving work based on that previous DNA testing. I'm not sure why it took from September to December. I think that's kind of weird. But whatever, we know how
I think it really is just
the
because
justice system works.
They were trying to be so sure because they were trying to get him on so many counts of murder.
I agree. Yeah,
4 at the beginning, but then we know now at least 40 something. So yeah.
And so December 5th of 2001, he was charged with 4 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. Carol Christensen, Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and then Cynthia Hins, who was not one of the 3 with DNA evidence, but she was found within literally feet of the other women. And so they just connected him that way. And then April 15th of 2002, so 4 months later, they officially filed to seek the death penalty. And then shortly before the charging deadline, so to add more charges, which was March 28th of 2003, a private lab, that same one that I mentioned earlier, found little tiny spheres of paint, a very specific kind of paint from his work where he painted trucks. And so that paint was found on Wendy Caulfield and Deborah Estes on a pair, one of them, it was on a pair of jeans that he strangled her with, that he used as like a ligature. And then, yeah, the paint matched a highly specialized type that they used at Kenworth.
Right. Yeah, he painted trucks. So there's a specific type of paint you have to use to paint a truck.
Yeah, it's
so
like super.
That's cool that they got him on that.
And that connected those other 2 women victims. And then March 27th of 2003, 3 more counts were filed for Caulfield, Estes, and Deborah Bonner, who was linked by the area and time period. So similar to Cynthia, she just got linked in there because of location of the bodies being found. And then we move on to, as Hannah said, he pled guilty, or not guilty, to the new 3 counts. And then they made a deal with him basically to be like, oh, well, if you plead guilty to all of these 7, then
yeah, that's a good point to mention, because he did at first plead not guilty. That is
many
a good point.
Times, yeah.
But basically at some point he realized, I don't know if it was from the help of his lawyer or he just came to terms with the fact that he was a piece of shit and he should be in jail. He eventually did plead guilty.
Unlikely.
So yeah, he admitted to, within that plea agreement, 7 of the charged cases, which were the 4 original plus those other 3, plus 40 to 47 more counts if the death penalty was forgotten, and he helped them lead to the undiscovered victims, along with those other terms that Hannah mentioned before, like there was a couple like super specific things, like he had to answer every single question that any King County sheriff officer asked him about the case. Like he could not refrain or he totally lost his plea agreement, which is so specific. And I feel like not that specific of a term of an agreement happens a lot in plea agreements in my experience of what I've read, which is, I don't know, I just feel like that's so weird. And then once again, if he didn't identify a certain victim and was later linked to it, he could totally be tried all over again and get the death penalty. So kind of hope that happens, but I also don't know where I stand on death penalties. So.
Because he talks about even forgetting some of his victims. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how that hasn't happened yet, that they asked him to identify a murder, or if, they found someone and he didn't identify, because, I don't know. I think that's weird.
Well, so they didn't even know about a lot of the victims until he started telling them about them. Really, they only have evidence to try him on the 7? Not that that's not bad, but they wouldn't have known jack shit if he wasn't like, oh yeah, I killed this person, this person, this person. Like,
I think that he really went with the fact that he would avoid death penalty completely if he was truthful. And I think that he didn't have the mental capacity to lie about it. And he was just like, oh, well, I'll be fine if I come clean. And he goes through a lot of periods of interviews where he claimed that he didn't remember a lot of details. And I have a couple things on that. So he claimed to kill over 60, and this number changes all the time based on what interview you're listening to, by the way. Effing weird. And then he admitted that he wanted to be as truthful as possible in these interviews. And this is like, he literally said this, like not a conclusion that somebody came to, but that he wanted to be portrayed in the best light possible when a book was written about him someday.
Yeah. So totally the same as a lot of serial killers who have this kind of like superiority complex, I guess, like that they're
narcissists.
They want to be famous. They want to be famous. That's why
they don't want to die. That's why they don't want to get the death penalty.
Yeah. Yeah. And they know that they want to be famous, and they know that they want to be like this notorious serial killer, which at the time that was the most killed people under one serial killer, I believe.
I think so. I think I saw something about that.
Might still be, actually, depending on how many people he actually killed, which we don't know.
The sheer number, like it could be up to like 90 victims.
That's what he said. Yeah.
Crazy. But he also mentioned in an interview that his anger came from 3 things: women manipulating men at his job to move up in the company, as well as late rent pay from his tenants, and his many divorces. So he just thought that was a good reason to kill some women, which is fucked up, but he also poor sleep and failure to stick up for himself. And I have no idea what he meant by that, but
it's interesting because
he's like
he's a weak man.
Yeah,
but I didn't find anything that said or alluded to that maybe he was bullied. I didn't find anything about that. So it's interesting that he felt like he couldn't stick up for himself when, as far as we know, he was never bullied or seen as this
other
crappy
than
guy
within maybe
other than by his wife's
unit or his parents. Is where that came from. And then also having to pay child support to his second wife, which is just
Gary, we don't like you.
Stupid reason is what I'm saying. And then he said that it released pressure for him, and eventually came around to admit that all of those things that I just said were false, and that he had always intended to kill these women, and that all women that he brought to his home he did murder. Who knows if that's true? He is all over the place in all his interviews. I'm like, dude, I don't even know what to believe. He was claiming to not have killed a couple different victims, which is why I think there could have been a copycat killer, or maybe some overlap with another serial killer. Amina, Tammy, an unidentified woman, and someone named Becky as well. he claimed to not have known any of them.
Hmm.
And this is when he said, "Why would I claim it if it isn't mine? Because I have pride in what I do. I don't want to take it from anybody else." Like,
Ew.
he wanted.
See, that's like the total opposite of like, I always think of like Henry Lee Lucas, who like admitted to a bunch of stuff that he didn't do for the
Mhm.
attention. So Gary was basically doing the opposite. He was like, I don't want attention if it's attention for something
Well,
I didn't
it's
do.
so gross because it's like he didn't want to take other attention away from other people, the people that actually did it, because like they did a good job, is basically
Yeah.
what he's saying,
Mhm.
which is so gross.
He
Like,
like
he wanted
appreciated them
them-
as artists.
He like
Yeah.
appreciated them totally,
Their
Caitlin.
work,
Like, that's
yeah, ew.
horrible. Anyways, but yeah, many of his interviews, like I said, are like contradictory, and he often claims that memory of specific victims is poor, which we think is likely due to how many, like the sheer number of victims, as well as his psychopathy.
Mhm.
And he had a good memory of everything else in his life. So he could tell you specific details about work, specific details about certain like memories with his wives, like literally everything in his life. He recounted the stabbing of that kid like perfectly, but for some
Yeah.
reason, these women he completely forgot about.
It's
And
because
just,
it's because he didn't care about them. I will keep coming back to that he hated these women so much that he couldn't care less about, you know, anything that had to do with them. And if it was taking up room in his brain, it was a waste of his time, basically.
yeah.
Is
And
what I think about that.
He totally felt that way, and it's just so disgusting and like upsetting. And I just think that there's not a lot else to say other than obviously he's a horrible person, and we don't even know the extent of all of his killings. And it's like, when I don't know, when I wish that we could have answers for all of these women, and I guess more so their families and the people that
yeah.
cared about them. And I think that there's a common misconception that prostitutes don't have anybody. And I mean, sometimes obviously that could be the case, but there's people that love them and that grew up with them, maybe even if they're not so close, and like that would
Mhm.
still impact you, that they were just brutally murdered and raped. And yeah, it's just so horrible.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the case. That's the facts. That's how we feel about it. Yeah, I keep drawing parallels between him and Ted Bundy because I at least feel like up until I researched this case, I knew so much more about Ted Bundy than I did about him. But this man was just as vile and disgusting as Ted Bundy was. So yeah, that's the case. That's Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who is rotting away in prison as we speak, which is good.
Thank God.
Caitlin, any final closing thoughts?
Man, this guy's terrible. But yeah, I feel you. Like, I think for whatever reason, he's not quite as popular, for lack of a better
Yeah.
word, as Ted Bundy. And I
Which
wonder if
is-
it's because like the timelines overlapped and like, I don't know, Ted Bundy
and
was just
so-
a lot more popular, I think. Like,
Yeah, and I think
people
it
know
might
who
be
that is.
Ted Bundy's case was so like it spanned over different states, and so there was a big portion like of FBI dealings that had to do with it. And so I wonder if that kind of made it more popular. But yeah, I totally agree. For some reason, his case isn't as popular, but it's just as messed up. So
Oh, totally. And I don't know. Do you know how many victims Ted Bundy had? Because I don't think it's as many.
no, I don't think it's as many.
I feel like it's
close.
less,
I'm pretty
but
sure
it's
it's
close. It's they both killed a lot of people. So
Yeah,
I guess
like
a lot more
two-
than most serial killers do.
Too many. And then yeah, so 30 confessed for Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
So
But Ted Bundy did a lot of the same. We won't get into Ted Bundy, but he did a lot of the same things where he would confess something and then he would, you know, kind of
yeah, like
backtrack.
go back and forth.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's like he thought he could save his ass in like certain respects.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, it's just, I guess we can close out. Did you guys want me to read off the names that I have pulled up?
Sure.
don't
Is
have
this
to.
all of
I just
this
thought
is
it-
all of the confirmed ones?
Let's
Yeah,
end
I just thought it
with-
might be nice.
Yeah,
Like-
let's end with Abby reading off their names. Just as kind of a remembrance that we kept referring to them as victims or women in this podcast, but they all, they were people and
Had feelings and
they're
lives.
missed. So go ahead, Abby, and then we'll
Yeah,
close that
and
episode.
even if they aren't missed by specific people, even if they literally had no one, like I'm gonna just take the one for that and say that like we miss them because they lost their lives for no reason other than that this man was a psychopath, and that is like it. So I believe that these are in some kind of order of like when they think that he killed them, but so we have Wendy Caulfield at 16, Giselle Lavorne at 19, Deborah Bonner at 23, Marcia Chapman at 31, Opal Mills at 16, Terry Milligan 16, Mary Bridget Meehan 18, Deborah Estes 15, Linda Rule 16, Denise Bush 23, Shonda Summers 16, Shirley Sherrill 18, Colleen Brockman 15, Alma Smith 18, Dolores Williams 17, Gail Matthews was 23, Andrea Childers was 19, Sandra Gabbert was 17, Kimmy K. Pitzor was 16, Mary Malver was 18, Carol Christensen was 21, Martina Otherly was 18, Cheryl Lee was 19, Cheryl Lee Wims was 18, Yvonne Antosh was 19, Carrie Royce was 15, Constance Neon was 19, Kelly Ware was 22, Tina Thompson was 21, April Buttram was 16, Debbie Abernathy was 26, Tracy Winston was 19, Maureen Feeney was 19, Mary Bello was 25, Pammy Event was 15, Delise Plager was 22, Kimberly Nelson was 21, Lisa Yates was 19, Mary West was 16, Cindy Smith was 17, Patricia Bargzak was 19, Roberta Hayes was 21, Marta Reeves at 36, Patricia Yellowrow was 38, Rebecca Marrero was 20, and then we have an unidentified white female 12 to 17, unidentified white female 17 to 19, unidentified white female 14 to 18, and that unidentified Black female 18 to 27.
Yeah.
That was a long
that,
list.
Abigail.
I feel so bad.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you guys enjoyed this first episode of ours as much as you can enjoy true crime, which obviously if you're here, you enjoy listening about true crime cases. So thanks so much for listening. If you guys have any recommendations or anything you want to see, you can
find us on Instagram.
Yeah, find us on Instagram, and it's at Who What Where pod, I'm pretty sure. Let me double check.
It's
Sorry,
podcast.
guys. Okay, yeah. Who What Where podcast on Instagram, and you can just DM us and I will see those and I will add them to our list.
We are also on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, we are. So Twitter is the only one that's a little bit weird. The name is www True Crime. So thanks so much for listening. We appreciate anybody who's listening to the podcast. And
you're still here.
and we will chat with you guys next time. Thanks.